Good morning or early afternoon, everybody. Thank you to our workgroup members for joining us today at the Climate Action Reserve to go over the development of our adipic acid production project protocol version 1.0. Quickly, just to give everybody a sense of what the purpose of today's meeting is, it's simply to present and solicit feedback from our workgroup members, our stakeholders here on key considerations for the protocol. Couple just housekeeping items. I know the workgroup members are now fully aware that they have the opportunity to actively participate throughout the meeting, though just request that you stay muted until you are speaking up, chiming in, and we want to take questions throughout the session as opposed to saving them all for the end. So feel free to speak up whenever. And all the other attendees and protocol development observers will be in listen only mode, but you are free to submit your questions in the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll see if we get to them at the end of the session. And anything we do not discuss here will of course follow, or answer here will of course follow up via email. Workgroup members, you will also, as I'll describe later, have the opportunity to submit formal comments or written comments via email. And of course, the slides and a recording of the presentation will be posted on our webpage shortly after. Quickly, just to go over our agenda, we'll run through some quick introductions and an overview of the protocol development and workgroup process before then spending a little bit more time just so we're all on the same page on the background and history with adipic acid production, greenhouse gas emissions, and the international offset carbon marketplace as it pertains to adipic acid projects. Before then, diving really into the protocol considerations listed here, project definition, the baseline scenario, leakage considerations, additionality, and location. If we have time, and it may or may not, but just having some time for open discussion to solicit any other suggestions or feedback not covered in the prior section. And then lastly, to just go over next steps. So without further ado, because I just realized I have not done so yet, I am Trevor Anderson, a policy manager here at the Climate Action Reserve. Well, I've been here for 3 months, or 3 years, sorry, next month. And I am the lead on the adipic acid protocol development. I was previously the lead on our nitrogen management protocol update and for the offset program, and on the solar PV methodology for our climate forward program. And we're joined today, as worker members are aware, by my colleague Heather Raven, who is our senior project coordinator and will be helping out coordinate the entire development process. And for those of you who may not be familiar, but I think everybody is here with the Climate Action Reserve, we're a nonprofit organization. It develops, promotes, and supports credible market-based climate change solutions. And so one of those said solutions is the development of high quality and stakeholder driven carbon offset project protocols with an emphasis on standardization. And we will be going over the development of one of those today. So now I'd like to take the time to let do a round robin here quickly with our workgroup members. If you'd all, I have you just here in alphabetical order by your last name. So if you'd all just like to, one by one, I guess, to go down the table here, introduce yourselves to the group.
Hi, hopefully everyone can hear me. This is Seth Baruch. I'm been involved in development of carbon offset methodology since the early days of CDM, and was involved in some of the first industrial gas projects specifically related to SF6, and very happy to join the group. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Seth.
Hi, I'm Philip Cunningham from Ruby Canyon Engineering. We're a third-party validator and verifier for carbon offset projects all over North America. And we've worked with Climeco on verifying a lot of their nitric acid projects. So we're here to give our feedback.
Great, thanks, Phil.
And I'm Bill Flutterbach with Climeco Corporation. Climeco, when we were founded a little over 10 years ago, the first protocol we assisted on with CAR actually was the nitric acid protocol. So it's been real nice to lead the implementation of that across the United States for the last decade. We have got tremendous success on that. So thanks to CAR for authoring that protocol, and really looking forward to participating in this work group as it relates to N2O from adipic acid.
Great, thanks, Bill. And I should note too that Climeco has helped give the reserve a head start with doing preliminary research as well and drafting the issue paper recently shared on our webpage.
Hello, John McDougall with Element Markets. Element Markets, while doesn't have specific participation or expertise in N2O, we are very heavily involved in various project types, including landfill methane capture and a few others, and registered with Climate Action Reserve on a number of projects. And this is something that we review and look at, and is interesting to us and our clients. So looking forward to supporting the working group. Thanks.
Great, thanks, John.
Hello, Lambert Schneider. I'm research coordinator for international climate policy at Öko-Institut in Germany. And I'm also a member of the CDM executive board and was previously a member of the CDM methodologies panel. And I've done some research on adipic acid specifically in my former role as working with Stockholm Environment Institute.
Great, thank you, Lambert, and thank you as well for being able to call in today on the state specific time. I appreciate it. And so you see, guys, here we have a small, maybe a bit of a smaller group than normal from reserves other protocol developments. But what I'm excited about is everyone here carries a different perspective. We have project developer perspective, verification body perspective. We have technical expertise, the broker perspective. So really happy about our group here, and thank you all for taking the time to advise the development of this protocol. We have some open outreach still with some regulators, communications with EPA staff and the Florida and Texas environmental agencies as well, so that we may have a regulator join in as well, but we will see. For now, we are moving on, and I'm again thrilled to have you all on board. So to quickly go over the overview here of the protocol development, I mean, obviously our end goal here, just so if you weren't already aware, is to create a robust adipic acid production protocol that will build on best practices for greenhouse gas accounting and reduce greenhouse gas emissions at adipic acid plants in order to generate voluntary carbon credits with the Climate Action Reserve, which are termed climate reserve tons. Of course, be adhering to high quality offset criteria and the reserve principles. We have a strong reputation for upholding environmental integrity. We're going to leverage lessons learned from the historical international offset projects from at adipic acid plants, and also leverage, and we could leverage, I guess, the pieces of the nitric acid production protocol where possible, as it's pretty similar, I guess, process to the adipic acid production as well. And of course, as we will be doing here today, soliciting and incorporating feedback from our expert stakeholders. Really quickly, the different components of our protocols. We always define the GHG project and then define the eligibility criteria, which includes the additionality assessment. The eligibility criteria is very important to get right, as well as the accurate quantification. So looking at the baseline emissions of project emissions and establishing the greenhouse gas assessment boundaries for what sources, takes, and reservoirs are included in the quantification. And then also establishing rigorous monitoring, reporting, and verification requirements as well. We're pretty lucky in this case for this project that these facilities already are required to report to the EPA, so get to really leverage those MRV requirements already in place for other purposes. Quickly show you the protocol development timeline and where we are now, right? So the reserve has already completed our internal research and scoping and presented on our findings a couple weeks ago in the middle of September. We've been developing a draft protocol, and we are here today having our first work group meeting, after which case we'll be taking in the feedback from you guys that we received today, and in any follow-up comments to revise our draft accordingly. And please all mark your calendars for October 31st. Thank you all of you for filling out your availability in the doodle poll, and throw that this date worked for all of you. So I'll be following up shortly after this to officially schedule the second work group meeting on October 31st, in which we'll go over the draft protocol on a section by section basis. And also I mentioned recently too, the issue paper has been recently posted for everyone's review. That's on our webpage, and we are targeting a board adoption in January. So we would like to, the goal is to have the entire protocol drafted and wrapped up by mid-December, and we of course always hold a 30-day public comment period as well. Just so you're all aware, worker members, the process here, as you'll see in this meeting in particular, the reserve identifies and solicits feedback on specific protocol criteria, and we expect that you all will review and provide your recommendations or feedback on said criteria. We're holding this meeting, we'll be holding another one. We'll request your active participation and to review our draft protocol and provide written comments whenever possible, as that is definitely just helps the most with our updates to the draft. Okay, we're doing on time. So I'm sure a lot of you here are already familiar with this, but again, it sets the stage for what our protocol consideration. So just making sure everyone is aware that adipic acid is a crystalline solid, is this building block to nylon, and nylon, as we can see here in these photos, is used in almost everything. So since nylon is such a key ingredient, if you will, to a host of different applications, that means adipic acid is the production of adipic acid is continued to stay steady for time to come in order to keep producing nylon. In the manufacturing process for adipic acid, there's a two-stage process here where we oxidize a cyclohexane and make a cyclohexanone or cyclohexanol mixture. This mixture is then combined with nitric acid to produce adipic acid. In the nitric acid production, N2O, nitrous oxide emissions, are also generated and emitted, as they are here in this process to create adipic acid. It is an unavoidable and unwanted byproduct, and nitrous oxide is roughly 300 times as potent as 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide. Thankfully though, adipic acid N2O abatement or control technology can be installed downstream of where the reaction occurs to treat the facility's off gas. So at the end of this whole reaction, we could essentially capture and destroy, or do some other type of technology to abate or mitigate the N2O emissions. As we provide an overview of what those technologies look like here. Catalytic destruction, so being able to destroy the nitrous oxide emissions using a catalyst, changing it up into, breaking it apart into different elements. There could be a selective catalytic reduction, so as the name implies, specifically targeting or selecting the N2O, or a non-selective catalytic reduction that chiefly targets or selects a different byproduct. Thermal destruction, so truly just using heat to destroy the N2O. There's also recycling possibilities here, where you could capture the N2O and use it as an input to produce other products, or even capture it to create nitric acid, which again is the precursor to one of the key precursors to developing adipic acid. And so in the current state of play here in the US, there are 2 adipic acid plants, and they both are fitted with some N2O abatement technology, and have been since the late 1990s as a big voluntary movement in the developed nations, where the owners agreed that this was a serious problem, the amount of N2O emissions being lost to the environment from this process, and voluntarily installed abatement technology. However, there are still barriers that exist that make it impractical to fully utilize the existing technology to completely 100% abate the N2O emissions. For example, the capital investments associated with purchasing or installing new technology, or increasing operating expenses from I guess, further utilizing the existing technology or using higher rates. And there might also be some trade-offs where in the US, these plants are regulated by the Clean Air Act to reduce their NOx or nitrogen oxide emissions, and so might prioritize that abatement over N2O abatement. So to quickly look at the trends here, and I'm happy to show a recent update, actually just as of last week, the EPA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program just provided 2018 emissions data for the 2 US plants in operation, as I also point here. So since 2015, there have only been 2 US adipic acid plants in operation. The third, there had been 3, but it had shut down. So there was one located in Texas, one located in Florida, and we can see here, as highlighted in red, how the emissions have since increased, which shows that there might have been some production shifting to from the plant that closed to one of the plants that doesn't abate the N2O as efficiently or to the as effectively as the other plant that had closed. So I mean this trend here is kind of alarming. It's going in the wrong direction we'd like to see, and as it jumped from even 7.4 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2017 to 10.3 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in 2018. So, the key takeaways here is that these 2 plants are already abating the majority of their emissions, and yet they still released over 10 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2018. And so there is a huge potential here to abate further reductions, further emissions, and just so just show some kind of equivalence to what this means, that the 10 million metric tons, that is equivalent to roughly 2.2 million passenger vehicles on the road for a year, taking those off, or the amount avoided from 2,200 wind turbines running for a year. So that is a large amount of greenhouse gas emissions. And we don't, as I kind of saying earlier, we don't anticipate adipic acid production trends to really decline or change in the near future as nylon stays in high demand. And then the big thing here for us, the biggest opportunity for offsets, the carbon marketplace, is that there aren't currently any economic incentives for the plant operators to abate N2O emissions further. And so we believe that carbon offsets can provide that incentive, and just have to be very careful with our protocol design. So with that, I definitely just want to highlight an overview of the history with international adipic acid offset projects. So starting with the clean development mechanism, baseline methodology for decomposition of N2O from existing adipic acid production plants. Simply, the projects install a catalytic or thermal N2O destruction facility at an existing plant. However, this methodology caused major issue of production shifting, that is known as carbon leakage, where it created a perverse incentive to shift production from non-CDM plants to CDM plants, which led to overcrediting and the generation of non-additional credits. Some of the reasons for this was due to the methodology set the baseline abatement emissions level at 0%. So that led to abnormally higher volume of credits being issued, as all abatement or any abatement was fully credited. And also the value, so the CERs, the certified emission reductions, is the credits under the clean development mechanism. The value for them was largely exceeded the value of the adipic acid product itself as well. So also caused for it to be overproduced at those CDM plants. And so, yeah, it was estimated, reference actually the next page, but that this caused a substantial shift in worldwide adipic acid production from non-CDM plants to CDM ones, resulting in roughly 20% of non-additional CERs. And it actually led the EU to ban the use of these offsets from its carbon market. So these are some issues that we definitely are going to be working to avoid or mitigate in the reserves protocol. And so we can look to one that was pretty successful with the joint implementation mechanism that had project-specific approaches in in developed nations under the Kyoto Protocol. And so there were 3 projects implemented, and 2 in Germany and 1 in France. And these adipic acid plants, just like the ones in where the joint implementation projects were implemented, just like the US plants, they had already voluntarily installed abatement technology. And so rather than using a baseline of 0% abatement, they started from a 90% abatement and only received the credits for joint implementation for the abatement beyond this level. And that is definitely what we're looking to do with the reserves protocol, something similar as well. And thanks to the incentives from the carbon marketplace, they were actually able to further increase abatement rates to over 97% by either retrofitting their existing technology or installing a second or redundant N2O abatement facility at the site. So what does this mean for us? The big lessons learned. Well, this is thanks to a couple of papers by the Stockholm Environment Institute and the OCO Institute, who I believe Lambert is an author on both of these papers, that we learned that the most straightforward and efficient way to effectively reduce the risk for leakage would be to set a baseline emissions benchmark, and that to make sure that only emission reductions beyond that benchmark would be credited. And so as we saw with the joint implementation projects, this would still provide a considerable incentives for the industry to abate the remaining N2O emissions stemming from adipic acid production. And so, yeah, these joint implementation projects show that high levels of N2O abatement can still be achieved, and possibly, yeah, we could possibly even completely eliminate the remaining N2O emissions, and that the carbon market, even with the CDM, did provide incentives to innovate and implement highly effective N2O abatement solutions that would not have been implemented otherwise. So that was a lot, but I again wanted to provide that context before we dive into the protocol considerations. And so we have an hour left, which I'm thrilled about, because this is where we'll be hoping to open this up for conversation. So I thought I would start with, this is probably the only slide here where I don't have actual questions on the slide, but I wanted to just start with the project definition. So this again, and everything here will be what the reserve is proposing for our protocol. And just wanting to start with this project definition so we're all on the same page before diving into the other aspects like the baseline, leakage, and additionality considerations. So our plan is to simply define a project as the installation and operation of either a new N2O control technology or the enhancement of an existing control technology at a single adipic acid plant that results in the reduction of N2O emissions that would otherwise have been vented to the atmosphere. And it's worth repeating, but our clear objective here is to only generate credits for the incremental emission reductions above a baseline based on an individual adipic acid plant's historical production emission rates and abatement levels. So just like with the joint implementation projects, our goal here is to only make sure our protocol is only quantifying emission reductions based on the incremental amount of emissions that are left to abate. I will pause there for a moment and see if any worker members would like to raise anything about this proposed definition.
Lambert speaking here. Thank you for the excellent presentation. I have one question regarding this enhancement of technology. Like, do you envisage that it could be purely operational improvements, so there's no investment made, but just an existing installation is used by a few percentages more? Or would you envisage that some type of investment would need to be made, that two technologies are combined, or that the technology is changed in order to enable more abatement?
Thank you, Lambert. Those are excellent questions, and actually some questions that I kind of had tabled on the additionality slide coming up. But absolutely, I mean, this is a great place to take them as well here. From what I understand, and please, other worker members who have more technical expertise in this industry, please feel to correct me or add to what I say. But from what I understand, the idea here would be an operational increase. So having increased operating expenses from higher utilization of the existing technology. If anybody else, please, you would like to add into that, maybe, because yeah, please feel free to.
Yeah, and I would agree with that, Lambert and Trevor, that I think in the cases, with the 2 plants in the United States, that it would be an enhancement of existing controls. So it would be, capital expenditures and operational expenditures associated with control enhancement. That would create the differential or the added value.
And so, Bill, then to add to that with a capital expenditure example, I guess something I guess could have mentioned too. I have previously worked with Environmental Defense Fund and worked on energy efficiency projects, so have some experience with, I guess, energy retrofits. So truly just have to ask this, don't know. So is there something akin to like a capital investment with a chiller where you add a variable frequency drive? Is there something akin to that you could, you have to make an investment in a new product to retrofit the existing control technology? Is there a possibility for that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of possibilities. So I think your table referenced 4 different opportunities, different ways to
Yep.
abate N2O, and I think, in most cases you summarized it really well. All of these facilities have to comply with their NOx emissions, and that's a big part of an adipic acid facility is their NOx emissions. So, they've designed controls, and at all times they're always going to be in compliance with their Clean Air Act Title V on NOx. And, to the case of N2O, they voluntarily abate. So, I think what we're seeing is that these technologies, absolutely need to be enhanced with significant investments, to get it above where it is today. And that's why I think that this protocol is going to be so important, that it is going to be an incentive for those companies that have to make some pretty significant investments to get above where they are, we're above that baseline.
Great, thank you both. And Phil, go for it. I see your
Yeah, my just same comment as Lambert. I know what a new technology is. Enhancement is pretty broad. I mean, just probably needs to be defined, lay out exactly what you mean by enhancement, because what it means to one person might not mean to somebody else. So it, probably needs to be pretty specific.
Yeah, I agree, and thank you for that feedback. And actually, Phil, as you are, represented from a verification body, that's actually even one of the points I had on a coming slide on how to verify. Again, yeah, the enhancement or the so yeah, this was great. Jumping the gun, at least in my plans, but absolutely, this was definitely something I had flagged for conversation. So thank you, Lambert, for kickstarting that. If there, how did that just happen? One moment. Okay, if there is anything further on this slide for the time being, I think where the most important thing to get right here is going to be the baseline and how we establish this. So leveraging the best practice from the IPCC, the guidelines, it's our proposal to establish a facility-specific baseline emission factor based on their historical data, because we are lucky in the U.S. that we have that information to leverage, that data is available to us. So that would be, to me, our best approach here to make sure these are facility-specific. But and I have these, so looking at the first bullet point here, I've laid out questions to, get the conversation going, because I'm truly curious and would like to solicit all your thoughts on what's the best way to actually going about establishing this factor, keeping in mind that we want it to be accurate and conservative, but not too conservative or overly restrictive. So just to touch on some of these sub bullets, whether this is something where we'd want to create an emission factor based on the N2O emissions in the year of the maximum adipic acid production, or if we'd want to do some kind of hybrid where you make the most conservative factor possible by doing the lowest N2O emissions from a given period of time divided by the maximum production over that same period of time. Or possibly we're also lucky, with some of the reported data that we could look at these facilities' historical abatement rates or destruction efficiencies. So could we even just leverage one of the destruction efficiencies, but against, what one do you pick? The maximum, the average, the minimum, and also leaving it open to having multiple options. I guess just an example of possibly letting them do, having a default option in place as a more conservative option. IPCC recommends defaults. Some of those papers from SEI and Elko Institute do as well. So just completely want to open the door here now for your thoughts on what you all think is the best way to establish the baseline emission factor.
Maybe I'll start off, Trevor, just to kick around a concept that may not be known to everybody that doesn't know this industry. So I think, because everybody is regulated, the two facilities are regulated for NOx emissions under their Title V. The more, as your graph showed adipic acid production emissions going up, and I think in 2018 we saw production going up.
Mm-hmm.
And the production going up has a lot to do with supporting electric vehicles on high performance plastics, lightens cars. It's an important component to some of the California, fuel standards. It's used in airbags, so as it's tied to the auto industry, we're seeing production go up. And I think, which is why, this protocol is so important. But I think as production goes up, the current facilities with their air pollution control systems, they're going to have to, typically the control technologies that abate N2O do not destroy NOx. So the more production goes up, the more they're going to have to lean on their NOx control and vent less to their N2O abaters. So you start to see an analogy that N2O emissions increase as adipic acid production increases. And I think, so one of the things that as we started to think about this is what's the right way to do this is, we kind of look back at the nitric acid protocol. The nitric acid protocol actually allows us to do, real-time testing to create a baseline. And all these facilities actually have N2O SEMS, continuous emission monitoring systems, already in place. So I think we're at an advantage that we have a lot of data in front of us. And I think the facilities also have a lot of data on the historical utilization of their N2O destruction devices and how they've utilized that over time versus, complying with their NOx limit, which is a mandatory limit. So I do think you do get an analogy where the more acid you produce, the greater your N2O emissions are going to be, simply because, some of the N2O abatement systems can't be utilized to the extent they were, and more gas needs to be directed to their NOx control system. So, one of the things that I always liked about the nitric protocol is that, we had this look back, right? We had a 5-year look back, and in this way, folks, couldn't, game the system. They had to look back at their historical production and say, okay, well, where did my greatest N2O emissions occur over the last 5 years? How does that correlate to my maximum nitric acid production? Or in this case, how does it correlate to our adipic acid production? So there needs to be a look back like that, I think, on adipic. So we're getting an understanding of, okay, in what year did they actually emit the most N2O? What's the relationship to adipic acid? And what's the relationship to their NOx, on how they actually manage their control devices to make sure that there's no gaming. And I think I always like with the data, I think if the sites have the data on how they've utilized their N2O destruction devices historically associated with production, I think that starts to get a good correlation then over how they've managed their facility. So I think it is, there's some moving parts, because this one's interesting, because in nitric acid, nobody had existing control. Everybody, abated, nobody abated. I think in this case, the work that Lambert has done in the Stockholm Institute, there's a lot of data out there showing that we need to address the level of abatement, whether or not it was voluntary or not, but how are we going to do it credibly? And I think this 5-year look back and the correlation of how the N2O destruction devices were used historically is a good place to start.
Great, thank you, Bill.
Trevor, this is Seth. The one comment I would have as I was looking over AM21, and there's so much precedent for this in existing methodologies, is looking at different options for calculating the baseline and taking the minimum, just to be as conservative as possible, and seeing various different stakeholders maybe out there to try and poke holes in these methodologies. So to the extent that you can demonstrate you're being conservative, I just generally think that's a good precedent to set.
Great, thank you, Seth.
Yeah,
because that would be the provide multiple options and select the most conservative one, that bullet there.
Right.
I wanted to ask, do you have a separate slide on the potential carbon leakage risks, or because that's very much related also to what approach you take for the baseline emission factor, or how basically you determine your baseline emissions by multiplying a certain amount of adipic acid production with a certain baseline emission factor, right? And so there are different combinations possible. So what happened in some CDM methodologies is that we took, for example, a minimum of the historical production and multiplied that with a minimum or a benchmark, whatever the baseline emission factor is. And so will we get back to the carbon leakage issue later? Then I would park that, but I think the issues are really linked. So yes. What baseline emission factor you use, and also what amount of acid, nitric acid, adipic acid production you use, whether it's the actual production or whether there's a cap on that, depends on whether or not there's a carbon leakage risk. So I could elaborate here further, I could stop.
Yes, thank you, Lambert. Actually, I'll jump and then come right back. But that is the next slide is going on leakage, because they are so closely connected. And I originally actually had a lot of this information all on this same slide and realized it was too much for one slide. But I completely agree. They are connected. And so it's fair game to talk about both right now. I think one thing I would like to add to your point that I guess I hadn't clarified before, right, and getting at the simplest way of setting this baseline, and something also that Bill had touched on. We do have the historical data, and then in the project, these facilities do have the continuous emission monitoring systems. So in the project, in each year of the project, which is termed the reporting period in our protocols, we will be able to get the amount of project emissions. We'll know how much N2O was emitted, and similarly we'll also then know how much, at the end of the day, how much adipic acid was produced. So I guess in the simplest way to set the baseline I see, is multiplying a facility specific emission factor of the N2O per adipic acid produced times the project adipic acid, like the amount that is produced in each reporting period. So then we would get an estimate then of what the baseline emissions, what the emissions would have looked like in the year of the reporting period, in the year of the project, if the new installation technology, if the new technology wasn't installed, or if the technology wasn't enhanced. So that is what I was thinking. Again, is like the most straightforward way to do it. Facility specific emission factor times the amount produced in the project, and so it's like a dynamic baseline, if you will. And then the emission reductions are then I would say those baseline emissions minus project emissions. But of more on that to go over with the draft. But at this stage, so that's and so that's why here definitely wanting to get a good sense of what that baseline emission factor should look like. What would be best to multiply the project adipic acid production by to get the most likely case of emissions in the absence of the project.
Yeah, I think one of the areas, Trevor, when I reflect back on nitric acid, secondary abatement, we have an emission factor because we can't test real-time N2O going into the control device because the control device is within the ammonia oxidation reactor itself, right? So, so in the secondary abatement system, we don't have the ability to do real-time N2O inlet. So we do real-time N2O inlet, for a period of time before the project starts, and that creates an emission factor that we apply that towards the amount of nitric acid produced during a campaign, and then we're testing real-time downstream. So we're getting real-time emissions, following the installation of the control. But we have this emission factor concept that you describe, and I think on the nitric acid tertiary, we don't have to have that because we actually are able to use real-time inlet, real-time outlet data. So we don't have to require this emission factor, and I actually think that is even more credible because we get real-time data inlet outlet to the part per million level. It's very, very accurate. I think the market really likes that. I think on the Adipic side, we have the capability to get real-time data before and after control devices, and we have the ability to look historically to say, how have they managed those control devices? So we actually have a destruction efficiency. We know the destruction efficiency every year for the last look back period. Say for the last 5 years, we know exactly what the overall N2O destruction efficiency was based on real data. And that one of the things I would think about is using the destruction efficiency number as that's the key number. If historically it's at 98%, or if historically it's at 80%, why was it there? That's what it was historically. Their emissions, the utilization of that control device has to be greater than that baseline, or there's no credits allowed. But I really think that actually, instead of an emission factor, that we look at utilizing the data recorders that we have at these facilities and get real-time data like the N2O tertiary abatement allows, but keep that historical destruction efficiency number as the real key item here, because nothing should be credited unless they destroy more than that. So I think it's similar to what you said.
Yeah, no, definitely, and yeah, I appreciate it. And then actually, as a follow-up, because it would, and I agree that could be the the best way forward, since we are lucky enough to have that information available to us. And so then I'll look at the third sub bullet here, and it would be a similar question for any historical data we use. Is it best to use the maximum destruction efficiency over a 5-year period, or the average, or the I would think the minimum would be the least conservative. But so I want to just throw that out there for debate as to what what we should look for to actually get that historical rate. Because I mean, from what I understand too, if I add on to that, if we look back,
question.
Yeah.
You go back to the EPA slide that you had with the emissions trend.
Yep. Sure.
I guess I'm a little confused about. Take 2013 for example, or just 12 and 13. I mean, sure. I guess the comment that the trend is emissions increasing with production doesn't fit for those 2 years. I mean, I'm not sure that there's really a good correlation between production and N2O emissions, would be my first comment. So I guess my question would be, why is that happening? Or, I mean, my second comment would be, I think it's great that there's EPA flight data on these sites. And I'm not trying to, insinuate anything, but that data is unaudited. So when they say we have a destruction efficiency of 83%, I mean, it's just a number in their report, and how they calculated that, I have no idea. So I guess my question would be, I don't know if taking EPA flight data as gold should be really the approach. I think it'd be better to, look at if they are tracking their data. Bill said that they have N2O sims on. If they are tracking that, that data for maximum destruction efficiency should probably be used, not what they've reported in flight, because, who knows I mean, it's not, the flight, they're not getting taxed on that. I mean, there's no, I'm not sure if there's really any incentive to report super accurately. I'm not saying that they're reporting wrong or something, but just, there's no really reason to put any time into that destruction efficiency number. So it would make me just want to see how they actually calculate that, because again, like this graph, like, things look like they're all over the place. I mean, I can't really, I mean, basically from, I guess the trends, from 2005 to 7 is okay, but then you have a huge drop and the production doesn't really drop that much. I mean, I don't think this is very, I don't know how, I don't think there's any correlation here personally, but, from a numbers standpoint. So I guess my question would be, what is going on here? Because it doesn't seem like, the emissions are following some trend with the production. And then furthermore, I don't know. I mean, I agree that the EPA flight data is good, but again, they're just reporting a number of their destruction efficiency, and without seeing the data or having the data audited, and there's really no incentive. I mean, and we've worked with, with the EPA on doing some quality check on greenhouse gas reporting in flight, and like obviously power plants are pretty easy to verify, but when you get into more complicated like industrial sectors, I mean, it's hard to say whether, those numbers are accurate just because nobody's really checking. So, I mean, the EPA does some checks. So, I mean, that would be my comment on those. Well, these numbers, and then also the flight data. I guess I'm just not sure where all the data is coming from. So.
Yeah, no, Phil, that's great observations. That's especially looking at the trends here. That's obviously one of my big takeaways as well too. That I think generally speaking, the greater the adipic acid production, the greater the N2O emissions. However, the reason we don't see that as the case here is because each plant has their own unique operations and their own abatement technology, and so there are a lot of shifts then in the amount of N2O emissions based on each respective plant's capabilities to abate emissions in a given year. I know at the end of the 2000s, there was a lot of plant idling. I mean, we did have the economic recession, so that, and then, but yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more with that takeaway that on paper, greater adipic acid production would result in greater N2O emissions, but that's not the case historically looking at U.S. adipic acid plants for the reasons I just mentioned, the variability at a given plant.
Maybe Trevor, just a real quick comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
To probably support what you said and what Phil said.
Yeah.
I think in 2015, one of the Invista plants shut down, so there was actually a lot of production shifted overseas to China. Then as the U.S. plants started to capture that production after that, but with when the emissions shut down at Invista, those Invista plants are old DuPont plants, and there's some really great public articles about 20 years ago DuPont had an initiative, and Trevor, you had talked about it, to look at ways to abate N2O. So the old DuPont facilities actually had levels of N2O abatement that because of the movement that DuPont made, back in the late 80s, I believe, they made big investments to voluntarily abate N2O. So when some of those plants shut down, like one did in 2015, ultimately some of that production got sent out to facilities that perhaps didn't have that same level of N2O control. So I don't think this graph does have great correlation. In fact, it has horrible correlation by itself. But I think the production in 2018 has gone up. I don't see the production number yet in 2018. I think that'll help to support what happened in the last year. But to Phil's point, I totally agree. You never want to look at the EPA data. We're used to Phil auditing projects. We know what the CARB process is, and I think if a facility has SEMS data and volumetric flow rate data that is, under Part 60, relative accuracy test audits were done, and that data is really tight, then I think we can support using on-site data. But if we can't, then that would be a real a real issue that I would share Phil's concerns on. But so it's something that we'll need to pay attention to as far as the data that is available and what QA/QC procedures did they follow. Most of the facilities that I'm aware of, do have the SEMS in place, do have the volumetric flow rate systems in place, and actually calibrated them to US EPA Part 60 because they were actually mandated to do that for their NOx systems. So I think we'll find out that the data is pretty robust at these sites, but if they're not, I'd share Phil's concern.
Yes, thank you both, and great insights on the EPA flight data for sure. I mean, I actually was thinking of following up with you all to show you the data I retrieved from the flight reports, and did have some question marks around the destruction efficiencies or abatement percentages in particular. But I think that kind of addresses that. So it sounds like we would be able to. Either way, if we're going to go forward with, I guess, a more traditional emission factor, or if we focus on the destruction efficiency, we would be able to get the plant-specific data from each plant. Is that correct?
Lambert speaking here. I have some more general questions. I mean, I'm less familiar with the principles of climate action reserve protocols than with CDM and some others. Mm-hmm. So under the CDM, one of the key principles is conservativeness. So generally, we aim, depending on the uncertainty, to determine emission reductions in a conservative manner, right? So tend to underestimate rather than overestimate. And given that there's kind of some uncertainty around the data, and also some uncertainty around the assumption whether what you assumed historically will be relevant for the future. So that's my first question, how you take that into account. I think if you just take historical data, you're not necessarily conservative. Maybe you are accurate if you assume that what happened historically will also happen in the future. And then another question is, like, also under the Paris Agreement, under Article 6, countries, at least the United States and Europe and most industrialized countries, they want to move away from only using historical data, but establish more principles that it should be best available technology, which is used as reference, or an emissions benchmark, etc. So also under the CDM, the whole discussion goes in a different direction than just using historical data as baselines. And so my question is a little bit, and also considering what is common practice in the industry. And for example, an abatement level of 80% would be one of the worst among all adipic acid plants that actually abate N2O emissions, probably. And so would it be eligible under the CAR and the practice under the CAR to use baseline emission factors which kind of do not present the common practice in the industry, at least in countries with similar contexts, etc. And use kind of, even if a plant maybe that's accurate, a plant hasn't abated much, to use that as a baseline? Or do you want to kind of set a benchmark which reflects at least the common practice in the industry? And that's also related to the carbon leakage issue, which we need to discuss, but I think it's also more related to the principles which underline the baseline settings more generally, what you are aiming for. And at least, for example, in the CDM, also for nitric acid, there was really a move away from trying to use only historical data, but to go for emission benchmarks that are reasonably derived, reasonably conservative, not overly conservative, still provide, of course, incentives to the industry, which avoid a number of issues, which avoid issues with the reliability of historical data, with possible issues with manipulation, etc. So I'm personally not so convinced of the direction here of taking necessarily historical data, and we also need to look into that, I think, in the context of possible carbon leakage risks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lambert, and I just would definitely just want to first and foremost say that the principle of conservativeness is one that the reserve upholds, one of our fundamental principles. So for all the reasons you've mentioned before, I think it is, really interesting considerations to, I mean, assessing the common practice across the industry. I mean, I guess my question for you being though, how would you recommend establishing such an emissions benchmark if not looking at historical trends or data on what the current abatement rates are or have been?
I think one of the ideas, or one which has done in many CDM methodology protocols, is that you look at plants in similar circumstances, at other plants, and you evaluate indeed historical data and trends.
Mm-hmm.
But from that, you do not necessarily take always the emission factor of a specific plant historically, but you look at the industry as a whole and
Okay.
what the trends are, and you also look to similar countries with similar circumstances. So of course it doesn't make sense to compare with plants in China, new plants which do not abate, but to consider what is the abatement rate in the 2 US plants, but maybe also in plants in similar economies and circumstances, and to see what the common practice is. Of course, also this varies. Like in Europe, the abatement is very high because we have an emission trading system. So again, that may not be completely representative for the situation in the US, etc. So one would need to look into that. But another approach would be to evaluate data, and based on that data to use an emission benchmark, or to require, another possibility is to use the lower value between historical emissions and emission benchmark. That's also an approach frequently chosen, which is conservative. So you say, okay, you use the lower baseline emission factor between a historical one and an emission benchmark, which represents kind of the minimum you would want to assume as a baseline, right? So,
yes.
I don't know what that should be. I mean, that's of course a little bit always also arbitrary, how you establish benchmarks, how it's a policy choice, how ambitious you make that, maybe not arbitrary, that's not the right word, but a policy choice.
Yeah.
But that's also an approach which could be taken. Or what we could do, what we did in the adipic acid CDM methodology, I think in the later revisions, is you take a minimum of, you could look at different production levels, and as a cautious approach, you take a conservative production level and a conservative baseline, and you combine these two.
Well, that's a great segue actually to the next, and thank you as well for the further feedback, and that kind of gets at the fourth sub bullet there of, if we one thing you just touched on, select to be the lower value between perhaps an emissions benchmark and a historical value, and so looking at different production values, I will say it sounds, just to quickly wrap up on this slide, it sounds like if we go the historical route, 5 years is a good look back period. I mean, it's consistent with our nitric acid protocol, and we do have 5 years worth of data to leverage. So that should not be a problem. I'll follow up, I guess, via email. Would like to get thoughts on this third bullet here, as a recycling option is one of the abatement technologies. But in interest of time, I think it is very important to touch on leakage considerations. And getting, kind of what Lambert just mentioned with looking at production, should an adjustment or risk factor be included in the quantification to mitigate the potential for production shifting? I'm fully aware, if we understand the U.S. and the plants in the U.S. are in completely, and the carbon market in the U.S. is the voluntary carbon market is in a completely different situation than the clean development mechanism marketplace, and even different from the joint implementation marketplace. But I definitely want to have this conversation while I have you experts here, and getting at what Lambert was saying, if in the project the adipic acid production is greater than perhaps a maximum adipic acid production in the baseline, do we need to add some kind of adjustment, I mean, and is that necessarily fair to think if in the US, if adipic acid production increases during the project years, you know, to truly know, oh, it's because of the carbon incentives, you know, there could be other reasons. And you know, if we do want to put some kind of cap or have some kind of adjustment factor, you know, at what upper limit would we do so? I mean, would it truly just be, oh, there's 1 ton more of, you know, adipic acid in the project than there was in the maximum in the baseline? Like, seemingly there could be some kind of way to get at a statistically significant increase. So those are just all, you know, my thoughts, my rambling thoughts on this aspect, and would love to get your feedback here on how you think we should incorporate potential for production shifting to, you know, from whether one plant in the US to the other, even if one isn't doing a project, or, you know, possibly production shifting from international plants over to the US. And if this is necessary, yeah.
No, I was going to say, you know, I do think that with these high cubic peak gases, there's a lot of precedent for that. Now, I just remember my experience with the SF6, where they did cap the baseline emission potential, you know, based on, you know, if the SF6 or the magnesium was production increased. And I know that the prices are pretty low in the voluntary market now, but, you know, that may not always be the case, especially if someday this possibly, I don't know if it's within the realm of possibility, but if this were ever adopted by the, you know, Air Resources Board and it was a compliance protocol and suddenly the prices shot up, I could really see the there is that potential there, and so I think we need something there. I don't know if it's, you know, 1 ton beyond the maximum production in the baseline. That's kind of what it's been in some of the other precedents I've seen, but I think simply saying, well, you know, the carbon prices are low, so that's unlikely to be, you know, an issue, I think is probably insufficient.
Thank you.
Maybe just a couple quick comments on that, and I think that background paper on the website talks a little bit about leakage, and, you know, so what Lambert experienced in an international world, you know, just we're in a totally different game here, different world, different pricing, and, you know, but to Seth's point, who knows what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Maybe for the voluntary market, you know, the prices will go up into the, you know, 18 euro, like it was in the CDM world, or higher. You know, that would probably be a good problem to have. You know, but right now we're not even close to that. In voluntary carbon, the value of voluntary carbon is minuscule versus adipic acid. So, you know, today we can all say that shifting in production or leakage is zero concern. But to Seth's point, you know, who knows what's in the future, right? So I think, you know, even though it's not a concern now, you know, the one way that the nitric acid protocol looked at it, you know, we started to look back, you know, years ago at like nameplate capacities, and then we realized that nameplate capacities absolutely mean nothing, because everybody's expanded their nitric acid plants, you know, long ago, so they produce greater than the nameplate capacity. So we got away from nameplate capacities, and then in the nitric acid protocol, we did a 5-year look back, and we created something called HNO3 max hourly, which is the maximum production of nitric acid on an hourly basis in a 5-year look back. And then that data point was used as to extrapolate what the maximum annual production could be if they produce that much on 8760, you know, continuously. And so it was a way to say, you know, leakage really won't occur here. Nameplate capacities aren't that accurate, but at least a 5-year look back on a maximum production on an hourly basis makes sense. You know, so I think, you know, we can look at some precedents perhaps of what CAR has done, and I think the theory behind some of those would be pretty applicable to the adipic acid space. But I hear what Seth is saying, because you never know. You never know.
And agree, it would be a good problem to have, right? That's what we ideally would all hope for, is that the the credit prices would increase, for sure.
Yeah.
I think it could be useful to do some more analysis to understand what the risk is. Of course, the situation here, I fully agree with what was said, is completely different to the CDM in particular because the baseline emission factor is different. That makes up a factor of 10. And I mean, the prices currently, the CDM prices are lower than the common prices in the voluntary market. And then we have CORSIA, and maybe the car will become eligible under CORSIA. And so the picture may change on prices. That's uncertain. So I think what's important to bear in mind is the regulatory context in which plants operate. That includes plants in Brazil and South Korea, where there's also a market for offset credits, at least in South Korea. It can be used in the South Korean emissions trading system, if I'm not mistaken. And then in Europe, we have the emissions trading system, where basically the free allocation for plants is very ambitious. It's much more ambitious than a baseline of 90% or something like that, and so on. So in question would be, how does it change the economic, how does it change the costs of producing a ton of adipic acid under different prices if you have a baseline emission factor of 90 or 95 or 85 or 99 or whatever the factor is. And so, so I think to assess whether there's a risk or not, it would be useful to do some more analysis, in particular to compare the situation with plants operating elsewhere. So whether there's a risk of production shifts at some higher prices or not. And then if there's a risk, I think the way to address it, I would think that it's best addressed by either adjusting baseline emission factor or a combination of setting a maximum adipic acid production eligible for crediting. That doesn't mean that you don't monitor total emissions from the plant, etc., but it's how you establish your total baseline emissions, whether you establish a cap on adipic acid production so that the plant couldn't claim more emission reductions from expanding adipic acid production. So that would directly address this risk if you cap the amount of adipic acid production, not the amount they can produce, but the one which is for calculating baseline emissions. Then you avoid any, so kind of you manage directly that risk. But first of all, I think the first step would be to assess whether the risk, under which circumstances the risk could be material, and what's the impact on the costs of producing adipic acid.
I'd like to just agree with Lambert on the financial stuff. I really think that this came up when years ago when I can remember, it was a car on web meeting on the nitric acid protocol talking about this stuff. And nitric acid, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Bill, but I think nitric acid is a lot more valuable than adipic acid. But I mean, like the plants where these projects are at, the amount of money they're making from carbon credits is just so, I mean, again, Bill, correct me if I'm wrong, it's got to be so low that looking at the financials, I really think would be a better way of just saying, look, if your total income from carbon credits is going to be below 0.1% of your total revenue, I mean, is there really a risk here that we need to go through? And I'm not trying to get myself out of work, but we got to go through all this work on the numbers to adjust a couple of credits when the plant is, they're concerned about so many other things about their bottom line than carbon credits. And in the US, I mean, it's so different. I mean, the amount of constraints on the plant in terms of environmental, I mean, there's just increasing production is going to give them headaches in so many other areas that, I mean, that's just, I guess my comment would be, looking at it financially at the company's bottom line, and I don't know if that'll be popular with them because it's obviously going to be confidential business information, but in terms if if we can sign NDAs or whatever, and just say, look, we just need this one number. We just need you to tell us what fraction of your what bottom line is from carbon credits, and if it's like if it's in the hundreds or thousands of a percent, I mean, they're really, I mean, you can't logically say there's a risk for them increasing production to get more carbon credits. It just, you know, I'll stop there, but.
And I think just one quick comment. I think keep it simple, stupid is what, the KISS philosophy
Right.
that my father always taught me. And so if we can keep it simple, great. I think at the end of the day, these adipic acid facilities aren't really, there is, the rate limiting steps aren't there as tight as a nitric plant. So they can, if production of electric cars increase, they would produce more adipic, and they'd be producing more adipic to create more nylon, performance fibers for the auto industry. So it would be nice not to have a limit on them when in reality it is such a small percentage. So I would like to think about the leakage issue and the production caps or avoidance of production caps if possible. We tried to do that like we could at nitric by taking the highest hourly and saying if you did that for 87.60, that's your cap. So we would hopefully never hit it. So I think we tried to skirt it before because it's not an issue here, to Phil's point. And I think that the issues that we have here are so different than what we have internationally in some of the CDM locations where they have very loose. I've been to a lot of these facilities. They have very loose NOx limits. So they may have higher N2O abatement, but their NOx levels are quite a bit higher than what we have. And oftentimes we can't abate N2O in the US because we have to abate NOx. So I think looking at facilities across the globe are important, but we have to always footnote it to realize that their conditions are quite a bit different than ours. And at all costs, facilities are always going to comply with their Clean Air Act Title V, which is NOx. So if they produce more, they may direct less N2O to a control device because they have to maintain that compliance. So I think I just want to put an air of caution on benchmarking globally. I think we only have 2 data sets in the US though. So, I think that's a pretty small data set. So it's an issue that I think as a team, it's going to be one of our challenges, I think, to go through this together, but I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you all so much for your feedback on this particular topic. I would agree, probably looking at the financials would be best here, and I agree with keeping it simple. I need to, for interest of time, need to move on from this topic, but certainly not the end of discussion here. One question I do have on this is, to your knowledge, is the, I guess, average US price of adipic acid in tons, tons per adipic acid, is that data available?
Yeah, I think we could provide that. I'd have to talk to the industries, but I think Trevor, we can provide that. So I'll have that as an action item.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Because at the very least, if there's a way to at least continue to keep tabs on, the changing prices in adipic acid and in the carbon credits, that'd be a good way to at least, keep our tabs on, potential for production shifting, at least from the carbon incentives. But I also, just generally agree with not necessarily wanting to put restrictions on adipic acid production in the case of, other drivers for it, like allowing the market, as long as we can make it clear that, production isn't increasing because of the carbon credit incentive, I want to let, the other market forces play out, maybe with, especially if it's because the EV marketplace is picking up and needs more nylon. That would be great. So now, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on quickly on, oops, my screen sharing is paused. That's bizarre.
Can sorry, I understand you, but just 1 minute. Can I clarify 2 issues?
Yep.
So just to clarify, I think the financial analysis, as we did it in our paper some time ago, it's quite simple and straightforward. If you know an adipic acid price, it's easy to calculate what the impact of under different carbon prices is on that price, right? So I'm not asking for something sophisticated. And the second point is on the cap. So just that there's no misunderstanding. It's not about capping the production. They can produce as much as they want. It's just the way how you determine your baseline emissions.
Okay.
And so it's just a calculation issue of baseline emissions, not about capping actual production.
Great, thank you, Lambert. And on that, the financial analysis, was that in the 2010 paper or the more recent one?
I think we did that in the 2010 paper.
Okay, I've been reviewing a lot of of literature on adipic acid the past couple of months. So, okay, great, thank you. I'll revisit that. Great, thank you. So then, additionality, it sounds like we touched on this earlier because, interest of time here, getting at for the, we kind of established there's two ways to be additional here, right? That they can further enhance the existing technology or install a new abatement technology. The second one, pretty straightforward if they install something new and it previously wasn't there. I mean, but I think, Phil, you had mentioned, getting a clearer definition on what it means to enhance the control technology is key here. And so that's my big takeaway here. But certainly feel free to, and after this, feel free to follow up with any formal written comments about this aspect. Similarly with legal requirement tests, I mean, Bill kind of already harped in on this. This is the big regulation to keep our eyes on with the tailoring rule, Title V here, the Clean Air Act, in the case that, if a permit does end up requiring, the installation of a best available control technology that is one of the ones installed for the carbon project, we would have to revisit the eligibility for that for sure. I'm not sure, we just open-ended question if there are any other regulations we need to be aware of that you guys are aware of in the US.
No, at this point, the tailoring rule is it. I mean, I think we would always want to keep an eye on new source performance standards, Trevor.
Yep.
To see if an NSPS would fit the space. Certainly under the current EPA administration, it wouldn't. But if a future one comes in that would be more interested in targeting GHGs, I think one pathway to get there is through the NSPS standards. But currently there's nothing out there.
Great, thank you. And one comment I do just want to make as well here, because we're about to go to location. I realize this might be, and I apologize for the background noise, downtown Los Angeles. Never know what could happen here in the city. But we have, focusing on the U.S., and regulations are a good example as to why, for the time being, we're focused on the U.S. I mean, that's generally what the reserve does as well with this protocol. For other protocol versions, or even unique protocols, the reserve is open, especially for North America, to look at creating protocols applicable to other regions. And I realize in the interest of time, might not have the time to really fully discuss this one, but I know it's possibly an unlikely scenario that a new adipic acid plant would be developed in the U.S. In the near future, but it would be ideal with with this first protocol version to already have applicability, should that be the case, so we don't later on have to make an update to include new plants in the protocol. So if there's, to me, the two biggest things that come to mind with bringing in a new plant would be how you establish the baseline, and then also how you would determine the additionality of that technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so I guess I can leave you with those as food for thought, because I want to, and so if you have any thoughts there, they would be greatly appreciated. And also, this really could be a bit ambitious with the first protocol version. I think it's most important to get at the first version, the protocol right, and get, and have it workable and lead to project implementation, and we can revisit this, at a later time. But definitely at least wanted to propose that to you all to think about. So again, in interest of time, and thank you. This was a great discussion. Again, I think the baseline and leakage are the two biggest things to get right with this protocol. And I greatly appreciate the discussion and look forward to your further feedback. So on that, with the next steps, we request that you please submit any comments to me by close of business the following Tuesday. So give me a little over a week to compose any written comments that you would like to echo or you didn't get to discuss today and during the webinar session. And we of course will take all comments into consideration as we then continue to draft the protocol. My goal is to have a protocol draft shared with you the week before the second worker meeting, which again, thank you all for filling out the doodle poll. I'll be following up shortly after this to schedule that, but it will be on Halloween, October 31st, and we'll be reviewing the draft protocol on a section by section basis. It's a longer session than today's, and we will definitely allow time for a break. Yeah, and so more to come on that. And then lastly, here, if you didn't have it already, here is my contact information. This does provide a link to our Adipic acid webpage. Yeah, without further ado, I just want to thank you all for your time, and I, greatly look forward to, keeping this, working with you all on this protocol.
Really enjoyed the kickoff meeting, Trevor. Thanks.
Hey, thank you.
So much.
Thanks, Trevor.
Take care, guys.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, everybody. Appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Great, thank you.
Bye.